Einige seiner Publikationstitel lauten Annäherung und Distanz, Schia, Azhar und die islamische Ökumene im 20. Jahrhundert und die Schia und die Koranfälschung. Das heutige Thema seines Vortrags lautet The Debate about the Authenticity of the Quran in Modern Times und befasst sich mit der in kleinen schiitischen Kreisen verbreitete Annahme der Koranfälschung, die vor allem in der Konfliktzeit der Akhbaris und Usulis zur Zeit der Safawiden präsent war und erneut Diskussionsschwerpunkt zwischen Schiiten und Sunniten im 20. Jahrhundert wurde. Dr. Rainer Brunner will talk about the Quran forgery, especially during the conflict between Akhbaris and Usulis in Safavid times, which became the center of the controversial debate between Sunnis and Shiites in the 20th century. Bitte sehr.
Ja, schönen Dank für die freundliche Einführung. Erst einmal die Frage, bin ich zu hören?
Ja, sind Sie.
Wunderbar. Dann nochmal ganz herzlichen Dank für die Einladung, die ganz unvermittelt kam und die mir Gelegenheit gegeben hat, wieder zu einem schon etwas älteren Forschungsthema zurückzugehen, was aber auch nicht ganz ungern geschehen ist. So I switched to English because the paper that I'm going to give here is in English and has already been given at a former occasion. So the debate about the authenticity of the Quran in modern times. The question of whether and to what extent the text of the existing Quran may have been corrupted and changed had constituted one of the major differences between Sunnite and Shiite theologians during the first centuries of Islamic thought. Many Shiite scholars refused to accept the addition of the text of the Quran that, according to widespread tradition, had been made on the orders of the third caliph, Osman, as no references to Ali and the Imams were to be found in it. The latter had been, in the eyes of their followers, clearly and unambiguously identified as the legitimate leaders of the Muslim community, and it was deemed simply inconceivable that this designation should not be backed by the Holy Book. There were two possible ways out of this dilemma. Those theologians of a more moderate spirit made do with interpreting the existing text so as to make it compatible with the Shiite claim for guidance. The Shiite practice of reading an inner meaning into many verses of the Quran, the so-called ta'wil, has its starting point precisely here. Others were less cautious and maintained that the Sunnis had deliberately forged the text by suppressing all the relevant passages. Evidence of this suspicion was provided by Shia theologians who compiled extensive collections of traditions that were traced back to the Imams themselves. The most outstanding scholar of this kind was Al-Kulayni, who died in 940, and his work Al-Kafi fi al-Maddin. One of the traditions preserved therein states that the number of the revealed Quranic verses was 17,000. The actual number of verses being less than 7,000, it seems clear that the rest must have been removed. It was only at the end of the 10th century that other opinions began to circulate, such as
Excuse me, Herr Brunner, Sie sollen nochmal Ihr Mikrofon anschalten. Entschuldigen Sie, das war aus Versehen. Jetzt. Ja.
Ah, ab wann war ich nicht mehr zu hören? Ab wann war es aus?
10 Sekunden.
Ah, okay. So I'll just go back 2 sentences. It was only at the end of the 10th century that other opinions began to circulate, such as Ibn Babuya, who strongly contested the claim that the original Quran had been more extensive than the existing one between its two covers. Finally, again some decades later, Al-Mufid's way of tackling the problem was generally accepted. Omissions from the established text, if there had been any, only affected the exegesis written down in Ali's copy of the Quran. No part of the revelation itself was deleted, but only its true explanation. All traditions implying tahrif were considered to be weak and therefore not reliable. Nevertheless, the conviction that the Quran had been corrupted continued to exist among a strong minority of scholars, or to be more precise, it resurfaced after several centuries. The revival of the so-called Akhbari tradition during the Safavid period was of special importance for this process. The name Akhbari denotes a current within Shi'ism that had existed already during the formative period, but was later driven back by their counterparts, the Usulis. The main difference between the two schools was marked by their handling of the second most important source of Islamic law, the traditions, Akhbar, traced back to the Prophet and the Imams. Whereas the Usulis demanded that all traditions had to be judged by reason and rejected in case of contradiction, the Akhbaris insisted upon the normative character of all sayings of the Imams, regardless of how probable or improbable they might seem to reason. As most traditions concerning tahrif are traced back to sayings of the Imams, the Akhbaris of the 17th and 18th centuries found much evidence in favor of this doctrine in the early compilations. Some of them treated the subject extremely cautiously. For instance, Mullah Mohsin Faid al-Kashani. In the introduction to his Quran commentary, he came to speak of tahrif and gave to understand that he believed in the distortion of the Quran. But then he realized the danger of such a belief. Since nobody knew the passages where tahrif had occurred, the Quran would lose all reliability, for the believer could then never be sure whether a specific verse or surah was complete or not. In the end, he saw no other possibility but to leave the question undecided. Another, more famous scholar in this regard is Muhammad Baqir al-Majlisi, the author of the monumental hadith collection Bihar al-Anwar, Oceans of Light. He too seemed to confirm the tahrif conviction before reminding the reader at the end of the chapter that the Imams themselves had urged the believers to rely on the existing Quran. Others, however, explicitly charged the Sunnis with having altered the text of the Quran. Muhammad Baqir al-Lahiji, for example, reproduced two entire surahs, which alluded to Ali's legitimate rule, and Abul Hassan al-Sharif al-Amili, the most outspoken representative of this current of thought, enclosed in the introduction of his tafsir a detailed defense of the tahrif theory and a rejection of potential counter-arguments. The Akhbari school survived well into the 19th century, as is shown by a number of allusions in this regard that can be found in several works. But all these scattered sentences and paragraphs were of minor importance as compared to the book Fasl al-Khitab fi Tahrif Kitab Rab al-Arbab, the unmistakable judgment on the distortion of the Book of the Lord, that appeared in lithographed form in Tehran in 1881. Its author was the Iranian divine Hussein Taqi al-Nuri at-Tabrisi, who lived from 1839 to 1902, and who is regarded by some as the greatest Shi'i hadith scholar since the days of al-Majlisi. On the very first page of his book, Hussein al-Nuri made it clear that he had written it, quote, in order to confirm the occurrence of distortion of the Quran and the disgrace of the oppressors and enemies, unquote. In the following 13 chapters, Nuri evidently sought to gather all existing narratives on the topic: the alleged distortion of the Jewish Torah and the Christian Gospel, the collection of the fragments of the revelations after Muhammad's death, the
Herr Brunner, Entschuldigung, nochmal, Herr Brunner, Sie sollen nochmal Ihr Mikrofon anschalten. Es ist so, dass wenn jemand neu hinkommt, manchmal, man will sein Mikrofon ausschalten und Ihr Mikrofon wird aus Versehen ausgeschaltet. Entschuldigen Sie, bitte fangen Sie vor 2 Sätze nochmal, ja?
Okay. So, Nuri evidently sought to gather all existing narratives on the topic: the alleged distortion of the Jewish Torah and the Christian Gospel, the collection of the fragments of the revelation after Muhammad's death, The different copies written by Ali and two companions of the Prophet, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud and Ubay ibn Ka'b, the official recension by Osman, and finally, the questions of abrogation and of different readings. The central chapters of the work are composed of more than 1,000 traditions taken from Sunnite and Shiite sources, all referring to tahrif either in general or with regard to specific verses. Only 17 surahs of the Quran out of 114 are exempted from this sweeping judgment. The most important examples are devoted to those passages in which the expressions fi Ali, on behalf of Ali, or al-Muhammad, the people of Muhammad, i.e. the Imams, were supposed to have disappeared. Nouri hardly doubts the reliability of the traditions, even when these are obviously contradictory. So, for example, when it is stated that 3/4 of the Surah al-Bara'a were omitted, and immediately afterwards 2/3 of the Surah al-Tawbah, both names denoting the same surah, the number 9. This is, of course, not due to theological carelessness, but it expresses the self-made akhbari dilemma that consisted in regarding all hadiths as equally authentic and normative. In the end, Nouri resumes and refutes some anticipated objections by those who deny the existence of tahrif, and once again confirms his point of view. Apart from the vast hadith corpus, there is one main argument that constantly recurs, and that is attributed by Nouri to the 6th Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq, namely, quote, "Whatsoever has befallen the sons of Israel, Banu Israel, will inevitably also befall this community of Muslims," unquote. And as, according to a well-known tradition backed by the Quran itself, both the Torah and the Gospel had been forged, there remained little doubt that the Quran must have suffered the same fate. It seems that the Shiite learned community at the Atabad did not wholeheartedly welcome the book. Ibn al-Shahrastani, although born some years after its publication, nevertheless remembers his student days with Ayatollah Mirza Hassan al-Shirazi in Samarra, who had incidentally also been Nouri's teacher, when he could hardly attend a lecture without finding Nouri, his book, and his publisher being heavily criticized and insulted. Other ulama, contemporaries of Nouri, did not confine themselves to internal attacks, but publicly condemned the book by writing refutations. Two of these may be mentioned by name. The first was one, Muhammad Hussein al-Shahrastani, who is not related to Ibn al-Din, who criticized Nouri for having been much too credulous as far as the hadith he quoted were concerned. The second reply to Nouri equally centered around Nouri's dealing with tradition and was composed by Mahmud ibn Abil Qasim al-Mu'arrab al-Tehrani, who also lived and taught at the Atabad in Iraq. His book obviously had a considerable influence on the debate, for Nouri immediately felt obliged to write a counter-refutation that, to the best of my knowledge, never appeared in print. He particularly tried to counteract the conclusion that his critics had drawn from reading the book. In a private talk to his most famous student, Agha Bozorg Tehrani, he is reported to have said that he had given it a wrong title. It would have been more appropriate to call it Fasl al-Khitab fi Adam Tahrif al-Kitab, so the unmistakable judgment on the non-existence of distortion, because its real aim, as he put it, was to prove that the existing Quran had not undergone any change, be it addition or omission or any other form. Yet at the same time, he emphasized that by tahrif, he did not mean change or alteration in general, but only, quote, the special case of dropping some revealed passages that were preserved by God's people, unquote. Moreover, he did not equate the word kitab with the existing Quran between its two covers, but with the revealed divine book, whereas the existing Quran had remained unchanged and in the same form that it had been given in the days of Osman. Thus, however, in spite of his conciliatory tone, he confirmed between the lines his conviction that the present Quran was not identical to the one that had been sent down to mankind. Up to this point, the debate about the authenticity of the Quran had remained largely within Shiism. It is true that there had been some polemic retorts by some famous Sunnite theologians in classical times, above all by Ibn Hazm and Ibn Taymiyyah. Their criticism had been especially sharp and uncompromising. Ibn Taymiyyah, for example, in a well-known passage, compared the Rafidis, as he used to call the Shi'is, to the Jews, because both had distorted the Holy Scripture, which incidentally shows that the accusation of Tahrif was a mutual one. But Sunnite interest in this question seems to have waned during the following centuries, and not even the revival of the defense of Tahrif by writers of the Akhbari tendency, culminating in Nuri's Fasl al-Khitab, met with any immediate repercussion among Sunnite authors. As far as I can see, the first discussion on Tahrif between a Sunnite and a Shiite author took place only in the 20th century, shortly before the First World War, when the Egyptian Azhar-educated scholar Yusuf ad-Dijwi published a book on the European views of Islam in general and the question of Tahrif in particular. In it, he included a chapter on the Shiite attitude towards the Quran, in which he relied extensively on Ibn Hazm and Ibn Taymiyyah and did not quote from Shiite sources at all. Consequently, he refused to notice or even acknowledge any change of the Shiite point of view and gave the impression that the present Shi'is, all of them, still clung to the early opinion that the Quranic text had been forged. Of special importance for him was the so-called Surah of the Two Lights, that he most probably took from a 17th century Persian heresiographical work called Dabistani Mazahib. Dijwi shared the conviction of some European Orientalists of the time, who insinuated that the surah had been composed by a Shiite author. Moreover, he adopted an exceptionally polemic tone throughout the chapter and followed the popular polemical custom of using the terms Shiite and Persian more or less as synonyms. Dijwi did not have to wait long for a response. In the very same year, 1913, the Iraqi Shi'i scholar Muhammad Hussein al-Kashif al-Ghita, in a 2-volume collection of critical articles on various topics, devoted some pages to Dijwi, whom he said to have met during his stay in Cairo 2 years previously. His criticism focused on Dijwi's one-sided preference for Sunnite polemic works of the Middle Ages and his uncritical quotation of the Surah of the Two Lights. Instead, he dissociated himself from those Shiites who had endorsed the idea of Tahrif and called upon his Egyptian counterpart to do the same in order to contribute to a united pan-Islamic front and to protect the Islamic religion. Only the Shiites themselves, he maintained, were capable of explaining their school of thought. Therefore, the quotation of Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn Hazm was completely null and void. Kashif al-Ghita here anticipated some arguments that were fairly typical of what was to become a kind of ecumenical debate between Sunnites and Shiites in the 20th century. Above all others in importance was the attempt to avoid critical discussions on controversial topics as far as possible, in order not to give the enemies from outside, mostly European colonialism, the opportunity to weaken Islam. Needless to say that he did not with a single word mention Nuri's much disputed work, that he without doubt knew, as he had been a student with Nuri in Najaf. Dijwi, on the other hand, did not mention this book either, which is likely due to the fact that he did not know it, and that it most probably was generally unknown outside Shiite circles up to that time. The first Sunnite writer who publicly seems to have taken notice of the book was the indefatigable Muhammad Rashid Rida, in the first part of his book As-Sunnah wa Shia, which appeared in 1928. On several occasions, the author attacked the belief in the forgery of the Quran that, according to him, was the hallmark of the extremist Shiites, the so-called Rulat, who exaggerated their veneration for Ali and the Imams. He mentioned and very briefly and superficially criticized Nuri's Tahrif book twice, without, however, going into it more deeply. From this, it may be concluded that he had not read the book personally and that he had only second-hand knowledge of it, as otherwise he might not in such a striking manner have underestimated the importance of Nuri's book and its value for polemical purposes. In the course of the following decades, until about 1950, there were only scattered remarks by Sunnite authors in this respect, but all of them were duly perceived and refuted by the Shiites. Two examples deserve special mention. The first one is the well-known book Al-Washi'a fi Naqd Aqaid al-Shia by the Russian-born Musa Jalala, written as a kind of modern travel book. This form, of course, served the purpose of enhancing his position as an author who relied on his own experience. At the same time, the book was far more dangerous to the Shiites than, for example, Dijwi's, who had merely repeated time-worn statements made by the usual suspects. Jalala, in his turn, dropped observations according to which he had not found a single Shi'i in the whole of Iraq and Iran who satisfactorily knew the Quran. He indeed went so far as to pretend that the Quran was completely out of use among the Shi'i population of these countries. Not surprisingly then, he attached to the question of tahrif the same value as to the imamate itself and accused the Shi'is in general of not believing in the same Quran as the Sunnis, and never having done so. In his eyes, contemporary Shi'ism was even more dreadful than in former times. This last sentence is generally, and until today, the most common justification for Sunnite polemicists with regard to the necessity of their polemical writings. The other example is even more important insofar as Abdallah al-Qasimi, at that time an outspoken Wahhabi, was the first Sunnite writer who wrote a separate chapter on Nuri's Fasl al-Khitab. In his own two-volume refutation of Shi'ism, he treated the terms tahrif and ta'wil more or less as synonyms, and thereby conveyed the impression that the traditional Shiite outlook on the interpretation of the Quran, that is characterized by the attempt to find an inner meaning of the verses, necessarily implied the distortion of the Holy Book. Moreover, he ended with an extensive attack of about 20 pages on Nuri. His counter-polemic, however, was not a source-critical or theological examination. Qasimi did not even bother to cite any Sunnite authorities against the possibility of tahrif. Instead, it was the rather one-dimensional assertion that Nuri's book proved the Shiite Persians' hatred of the Muslim Arabs and their vengeful attempt to undermine both the religion and the state. This sharp line of separation between Arabs and Persians, the latter being marked by their adherence to Shi'ism that in turn became a religion of its own, all this seemed to be roughly corresponding to the Salafiyya convictions of the day that led to a kind of Arabization of Islam in Egypt during the 1930s. Among these authors, Sunni Islam began to bear trace of an Arab national religion. Regardless of the existence of Lebanese and Iraqi Shiites, they regarded it as extremely suitable in order to dissociate themselves from the Persians. Looking back from our times, one may feel something like a gentle irony when considering the fact that Qasimi, this founding father of modern tahrif polemics, only a few years later converted from his staunch Wahhabism to an equally staunch atheism and became one of the most radical critics of religion in general. It goes without saying that both books, Jalala's travelogue as well as Qasimi's heresiography, met with furious Shiite refutations, even from the side of two of the most renowned spiritual leaders of the time, Mohsin al-Amin and Abdul Hussein Sharaf-ad-Din. They, in turn, not only played down the number and importance of the Shiite traditions in favor of tahrif, but also began to remind the Sunnis of the large number of Sunnite narratives of the same tendency. Indeed, there is a great variety of Sunnite extra-canonical readings and, what is more important, traditions that suggest the omission of a number of verses from the original revelation. Those omissions had of course nothing to do with the Shiite point of view, but were nevertheless highly remarkable. Jalaluddin as-Suyuti, for example, quoted some traditions according to which Surah 33 had originally been of much greater length than it is today. On the other hand, many a classical Shiite source was cited to show that the most important Shiite authors had always spoken against Tahrif. But all these elaborate countercritics did not prevent Jalala's book from finally establishing itself as one of the most influential anti-Shiite polemical writings of the past century. One of the first who approvingly quoted from it was Muhammad Qud Ali. And Muhammad Hussein al-Dhahabi, the Egyptian Minister for Religious Endowments, who was to be assassinated by fundamentalist groups in 1977, composed his own 3-volume book on the interpretation and the interpreters of the Quran. The section on Tahrif was largely based on Jalala. As far as the Sunnite attacks on Nuri and his book are concerned, Shiite writers did not waste a single line to defend their co-religionists. The most lenient form of critique was the statement that he had exercised the wrong kind of legal reasoning, a wrong kind of ijtihad. All Shiite writers who mentioned Nuri from now on felt free to heavily criticize him themselves for having relied on weak narratives and for having therefore misunderstood and misrepresented Shiite traditions. Needless to say that all of them explicitly dissociate themselves from Nuri and portray him as being the single exception among a vast majority of anti-Tahrif conviction. Things became more and more implacable in the 1950s, when the question of Tahrif gradually moved to the center of the discussion. The background for this is to be seen in the efforts made by some Sunnite and Shiite scholars to promote a kind of inner Islamic ecumenical activity during these years. This movement had gained enormous momentum after the foundation of a rapprochement society, Jamaat al-Taqrib bain al-Madhahib al-Islamiyya, in Cairo in 1947. The society was not only backed by a number of leading sheikhs of the Al-Azhar University, but also enjoyed the tacit support of the leading Shiite cleric of the day, Ayatollah Hossein Boroujerdi. But opposition to a dialogue or any other form of cooperation between Sunnism and Shiism remained vigorous from the very beginning. Its main representatives were those Sunnites who came from the Salafi or Wahhabi schools of thought that had always been skeptical about Shiism, to say the least. In the following years, both groups, the Shiite supporters of ecumenism and the Sunnite opponents, increasingly argued by referring to Tahrif, but of course for different purposes. Thus, the eminent Shi'i scholar Abul Qasim al-Khou'i openly discussed Tahrif in his much-read commentary of the Quran, Al-Bayan fi Tafsir al-Quran. Without mentioning Nuri by name, he denied some of the latter's most frequent arguments. Some of his replies are not without a certain amount of astuteness. For instance, when he repelled Nuri's analogy between the Muslim Ummah and the fate of the pre-Islamic communities by stating that this tradition needed not necessarily refer only to the past. The distortion of the Quran might just as well take place in the future. On the other hand, the adversaries of Shiism in general, and ecumenism in particular, also discovered the usefulness of the Tahrif issue. By far the most important contribution to the dispute was made by Muhyiddin al-Khatib, who at the time of the First World War had been an ardent Arab nationalist, and in later times became one of the outstanding figures of Salafiyya thought in Egypt. In the 1950s, he was for some years editor-in-chief of the official Azhar journal, that thereby turned into a stronghold of Sunnite orthodoxy against ecumenism. Khatib did not at once concentrate on Tahrif. In his first articles against Shiism, published immediately after the foundation of the Taqrib Society, he did not even mention this problem, but instead gave priority to more traditional issues such as the companions of the Prophet, the Shiite belief in the Mahdi, and the sinlessness of the Imams. But in view of the wide response to the society, he seemingly felt compelled to bring up heavy artillery. The climax of his struggle was reached after the rector of the Azhar University, Mahmoud Shashid, had issued in July 1959 a fatwa in which he formally acknowledged Shiism as a school of law in line with the four Sunni schools. Immediately afterwards, one of the Wahhabi state theologians of Saudi Arabia, rather hypocritically, wrote a letter to the Azhar in which he asked for a statement concerning Nuri's notorious Tahrif book that he included in his letter, just to be on the safe side. Again, some times later, Khatib published his famous polemical booklet, The Broad Lines of the Fundaments on which the Imamite Twelver Shiite religion is based, in which he described Shiism as he saw it, namely as a religion of its own, standing outside of Islam. Although only some 5 pages dealt with Tahrif, this passage turned out to be one of the most fateful blows against Shiism in the 20th century. With particular scorn, he mocked Nuri and thoroughly cut off the line of retreat by stating that any dissociation by Shi'is was completely worthless, as it only occurred out of taqiyya. The last dramatic signpost for the relations between Sunnism and Shiism was the Iranian Revolution in 1979. Since then, the number of mutual polemical writings has once again increased, and it is hardly astonishing that the problem of Tahrif has also been affected by this general trend. As far as Shiite writers are concerned, 2 methods of coping with the problem are to be observed. The first is apology. Thus, the Shiite author Ja'far Murtada al-Amili chose a remarkably careful expression and spoke of a group of reports of which one may perhaps say that their outward and literal meaning points to the distortion of the Quran. But more important than this highly euphemistic treatment of the issue is the second method that consists in open criticism. A plethora of new books have been published and older ones have been reprinted by Shiite writers or institutions, mostly propaganda organizations in Iran, in which Tahrif forms the central theme. Finally, there is hardly a new book on the general subject of the Quranic sciences whose author can afford not to write a long chapter dealing with Tahrif. As a general rule, one does not find anything new in these writings, as they mostly consist of quotations older, above all classical sources. Thus, Al-Kulayni and Al-Mufid are practically endlessly reproduced. On the other hand, the number of Sunnite polemical writings, usually centered around Nuri's Fasl al-Khitab and mostly paying tribute to Al-Khatib, has also become firmly established. The line of argumentation in these books is equally deplorable. Their authors scarcely bother to distinguish between different currents or stages of the Shiite thought, but generally blame the whole of Shiism, past and present, for believing in Tahrif and disguising themselves by means of taqiyya. Only very rarely does one find authors who are willing to adopt a more moderate view and to differentiate the inner Shiite currents in this regard, at least to some extent. Oddly enough, there is no visible difference with regard to the contents of the debate, because both Sunnis and Shias emphasize the completeness and authenticity of the Quran. Therefore, the main argument against the possibility of Tahrif, the reference to the Quran itself, namely verse 9 of Surah 15, it is we who have sent down the remembrance and we watch over it. This reference can be found on both sides without distinction. Muhammad Hussein Tabatabai, for example, one of the leading Shiite clerics of the second half of the 20th century, devoted no less than 30 pages of his Quran commentary to this verse. What is quite interesting about this development is the fact that its discussion within Shiism, that had been relatively lively during the past 250 years, completely died down in the 20th century. This may very well be attributed to Nuri's book on Tahrif and the effects that it had among his Sunni adversaries. Khatib certainly hit the bull's eye when he sarcastically remarked that his book was all the more embarrassing as far as the Shiites were concerned, as its author collected even the most remote evidences that otherwise nobody would ever have found in the bulk of Shiite literature. Within Shiism, all utterances are scrupulously avoided that might in the slightest way be interpreted as being in favor of Tahrif. Some scholars not even shrink from prohibiting the publication of a point of view that could be doubtful. Muhammad al-Hussein al-Kashif al-Ghita, whom I already mentioned, in later years forbade his colleague Arabo Zorga Tehrani to publish a book that was intended to be in defense of Nuri. Both scholars, ironically, had been students with Nuri. Today, the whole dispute over Tahrif is about the assessment of the early Shiite Hadith compilations and of later Shiite authors who took these traditions for granted. It seems rather ironical, insofar as religious polemics can be ironical, that the controversy between Sunnites and Shiites on this question in modern times only started when the Shiite scholars unanimously agreed on abandoning the last signs of ambiguity and on denying their own Tahrif traditions. And it is also somewhat ironical that there is nowadays in Iran a university named after Hussein Taqi al-Nuri, the Daneshgah Alamei Muhaddis Nuri in Mazandaran. It hosts 3 faculties: economic and administrative sciences, engineering and technology, and natural resources, but none about the classical Islamic sciences, let alone the Quran. This, in my eyes, is yet another subtle turn in the Tahrif discussion, which is, as in most cases of modern intellectual history in modern societies, a fight over memory, a fight over history as it should have been. Thank you very much.
Ich bedanke mich. Vielen Dank für Ihre schöne, umfassende Vortrag, das fast wichtigste Themen in diesem Zusammenhang thematisiert hat. Ich denke, wir haben ungefähr, ich sollte mich bedanken, dass Sie alles, sagen wir mal, korrekt gemacht haben. Sie haben richtig eine halbe Stunde gesprochen. Wir haben jetzt ungefähr 12 Minuten Zeit wegen einiger Fragen. Ich weiß, dass eventuell mehr Fragen geben kann, aber ich denke, wir werden uns mindestens mit diesen einigen Minuten begnügen. Ich weiß nicht, ob Fragen gibt oder nicht. Am besten soll man mit Hand zeigen, dass man fragen will, dann können wir das kontrollieren. Bitte schon, die Fragen sind offen. Herr Dr. Gerami, bitte schon.
Okay, hello everyone. Hello, Professor Brunner. Thank you for your great presentation. I have a kind of maybe substantial question. Have you ever seen Tawatur al-Quran written by Khurram Ali? Tawatur al-Quran. Tawatur al-Quran. It is a treatise which I had also contributed to its edition several years ago, and I do think it is very important and maybe the earliest independent work on the refutation of Tahrif in Shiism. And I can also share with you, I do think we should have a look at that treatise, and we can change some stereotypical views on the interactions between Akhbarism and Usulism in the Safavid period regarding the Tahrif al-Quran. So because he doesn't take normal position of Akhbaris regarding the Quran, he tries to refuse the Tahrif al-Quran and also demonstrate its tawatur. And also, I do think it should be an important work for your study. Also, my question, I want to briefly, if you can tell me, what was your exact contribution or your point to the field which has never been studied so far, if it is possible?
Well, I mean, first of all, thank you very much for these references. I'd be highly grateful if you could send me at some point maybe the bibliographical reference in order to simply for me also to check these early sources. I was not aware of this particular book which you just mentioned. As far as your second question is concerned, what exactly do you mean, my contribution on what?
Yes, I got your information. It was very great. But what was exactly your result? What was your point of focus that has never been studied so far by other scholars in the field? If you can summarize maybe your point and your contribution.
Well, I guess there's hardly any study, any previous study on Nouri's book on Tahrif. There are a few studies on other things which he did on Hadith, on his Hadith compilations, for example. But as far as I can see, nobody so far has really made a thorough study on his Fasl al-Khitab. I came to be interested in this topic when I dealt with the ecumenical rapprochement between Sunnis and Shiites in the 20th century. And as I tried to make it clear in the end, I found it a little ironical that in the 20th century, at a time when the Shi'i authors themselves had started to agree that the Quran was not falsified, that only then the Sunnite polemicists actually discovered the topic and in a way started a polemical exchange that may be read as a kind of putting things upside down as far as the actual intellectual history of Shiism is concerned. It would have made much more sense if Sunnite authors in preceding centuries, during the Safavid period, for example, if there had been any Ottoman scholars who had written polemics against Shiism, this would have made more sense. But the ironical thing is that this discussion between the two confessions, between the two sects, only started in the 20th century at a point when within Shiism, this matter was actually already dying down and it was solved. And this is something which I simply found very interesting from a purely intellectual and, well, sort of socio-intellectual also reason.
Okay, thank you.
Vielen Dank. Gibt es weitere Fragen? Is any other questions? Ja, Herr Gorke, Andras Gorke, bitteschön.
Hi, thank you for the talk and nice to see you again. You mentioned the collection of all the traditions, Shiite and Sunni tradition, about the collection of the Quran and the compilation of the Quran. Are there any specific Shiite traditions about that, and to what extent do they differ from Sunni traditions on the topic? Thank you.
About the compilation of the Quran in general or at a specific period?
About the early compilation, so the compilation of Ali, of Ibn Mas'ud.
Well, as far as I can remember, there are not very distinctive subchapters on these traditions which are to be found in Sunnite sources, but all the classical sources, especially Al-Kulayni's famous compilation, do have quite a few subchapters, quite a few passages, both on the collection of the Quran and especially also about the question of the relation between the Quran and the Imamis. Some of these traditions are not, well, are widespread among over all the entire compilations. Sometimes in even more remote passages. I remember that some of the traditions that Kulayni cites are in a chapter which is called Nawadir, so rare traditions, so to speak. Actually, I don't remember whether there are comparative traditions in there. I doubt it. But there are in all these early sources, there are, of course, quite a number of hadith pertaining to the collection of the Quran from a Shia point of view.
Thank you.
Okay, vielen Dank. Gibt es weitere Fragen? Is there any other question? Herr Dr. Brunner, wir haben auch eine Frage im Chat.
Mhm.
Wenn Sie das lesen, sollen Sie hier unten letzte Frage einfach durchlesen. Sie können auch laut durchlesen, so die anderen auch mitbekommen.
I think it should be this one. Could you please explain about how and when these falsification of Quran hadiths were generated or appeared among Shi'is? Because as Modawisi and recently Ansari argued, they appear mainly in the 3rd century and among groups with more extremist tendencies as a reaction or background to Sunni debates on variations and 7 ahluf. Well, of course, I mean, most of these hadiths go back to the pre-occultation period of Shi'ism, which means to the Imamite stage, not the Ithna Ashari stage of Shi'i hadith, at a time when Shi'ism apparently was searching its own identity and had not yet come to found anything, or anything definitive. Modawisi, in his rather famous and detailed article, holds the theory that it was actually Shiites being duped by Sunnite traditionists who were the first to sort of invent these traditions, and some Shiites only quoted them being far too credulous as far as their authenticity is concerned. I think that such an interpretation is a little apologetic. At that time, my impression is that at that time, we're talking here about the 8th, 9th, and early 10th century, maybe, that there was not yet unanimity reached, neither within Shi'ism, probably nor within Sunnism, about the authenticity of such hadiths, and therefore it was part of the identity finding of Shi'is, of 12er Shi'is, that played a certain role. And it is very characteristic that as soon as the Imami Shi'ism turned into the 12er Shi'ism proper, which means after the occultation of the 12th Imam, and after sort of narrowing the perspective of what Shi'ism actually should be in the future, that all those theologians and all those traditionists of the later 10th century and later on then started to refute these early Shiite traditions. So my impression is they started very early, were then refuted in the 10th, 11th centuries, resurfaced later on during the quarrel between Akhbaris and Usulis, and it was Nuri who brought it to a head, and afterwards it completely died down within Shi'ism. This is approximately these are the broad outlines of the whole debate.